Welcome to our seminar, Joining Forces with the Indo-Pacific, Kickstarting Europe's New Approach to the Region. My name is Jana Puglierin, and I'm ECFR's Berlin Head of Office. 4 months ago, on September 16, to be exact, the External Action Service and the Commission of the European Union released a joint communication entitled EU Strategy for Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, articulating the main lines and directions of EU policies in the region in the forthcoming years. The implementation of this Indo-Pacific strategy is now going to be one of the main priorities of the French presidency of the European Union. Hence, the support of the French Ministry for European and External Affairs, in particular, the Center for Analysis, Forecasting and Strategy, as well as the French permanent representation to the EU for this seminar. And I want to take this opportunity to thank them very much for supporting us. But even with France making the Indo-Pacific a priority of its Council presidency, the success of the strategy will depend on a collective effort, involving not just the EAS and the Commission, but the European member states as well. This is all the more important because the strategy did emerge at a time when Europe is recalibrating its role in the world, sometimes as a consequence of external events such as the COVID-19 pandemic or AUKUS, sometimes as the outcome of a re-evaluation process which has just seen the release of the Global Gateway and will soon lead to the publication of the EU's new strategic compass. Each of these new initiatives could help pave the way for a successful implementation of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But of even greater importance for the success of the strategy will be the capacity of the EU and its member states to connect effectively with partners in the Indo-Pacific region. The EU strategy will be an effective tool for cooperation only if it is perceived as useful by the actors themselves, if it does respond to their needs just as much as to the needs of Europe. In order to foster the dialogue with Europe's main partners across the Indo-Pacific, we have therefore invited representatives from Japan, from India, Singapore, and Hong Kong at today's conference to hear their thoughts on how the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific can be brought to life effectively. The seminar today will not address every single issue contained in the strategy. We have, for example, deliberately left apart security-related questions which have been discussed extensively already in the context of AUKUS in recent months. Instead, today, we focus on issues which we believe are of concern for every member state, not just because trade, connectivity, or the green transition have a potential impact on each member state, but because these three topics have the potential to redefine our relations with the region and ultimately affect the global balance of power. Although we would all agree on the importance of the Indo-Pacific for Europe, Europe's ambition in the region are still young, and so is the debate on the Indo-Pacific within Europe. It is therefore necessary to contextualize the EU strategy for cooperation, as well as Europe's priorities and interests in the region. In order to do that, we have the great privilege to welcome Ambassador Michel Miraillet, Director General of Globalization, Culture, Education and International Development at the French Ministry of Europe and External Affairs. We're very grateful that you agreed to join us, Ambassador. And the Ambassador will speak about the geopolitical context and why it is important for the EU to be involved in the Indo-Pacific, but also elaborate on some of the key domains of cooperation that the French government intends to promote during its presidency of the EU. Ambassador Miraillet has had a long and distinguished diplomatic career. He served as Director for Strategic Affairs at the French Ministry of Defense and has been ambassador to Brazil, as well as to the United Arab Emirates. He is currently the Director General of Globalization, Culture, Education and International Development at the French Ministry of Europe and External Affairs, and no one could therefore be more qualified to set the scene for our discussions today. Ambassador Miraillet, thank you for being here with us today, and now the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena. Thank you very much for your kind words. I don't know if I deserve them, but let me say that I'm very happy to be with you this morning as an introduction to this virtual session on EU Indo-Pacific relations. Let me first thank our long-standing partner, ECFR, for this welcome initiative, which I hope will contribute to help foster a joint understanding of the region from a pan-European perspective. This seminar will be a useful exercise for us because it comes at the right time. Adopting the EU Indo-Pacific strategy last September was a fundamental step towards taking this region into account in the Union's strategic outlook even more so when one recalls that before that the term Indo-Pacific didn't appear in any official EU document. The speed with which we have achieved this result is in itself significant. It is symptomatic of a change in perceptions of international power relations and their potential impact on Europe. Although France was a driving force, having adopted an Indo-Pacific strategy in 2018 and revised it in 2021, it was not the only one, since Germany and the Netherlands also drew up guidelines for the Indo-Pacific and contributed to this result. However, we are aware that some kind of debate will continue. The recent survey carried out by the ECFR is insightful in that regard, and I certainly share many of its conclusions. Those among us who are convinced will need to keep on engaging those who are less and who continue to think that there are more important regions for Europe than this one. Why do we need the EU to focus more on the Indo-Pacific? The reasons are obvious. The European strategy recalls the basic economic reasons why the Indo-Pacific is strategic for Europe. A region that is the engine of world growth. It accounts for 40% of global wealth today and up to 50% into 2040, according to the IMF. The second most important destination for European exports, where 4 countries are among the EU's top 10 trading partners, and strategic maritime routes for our supplies. The other element is, of course, the rise of China's assertiveness in the region, expressed in an increasingly forceful manner. This is problematic in many ways. For the sovereignty of the Indo-Pacific countries in terms of maritime or even economic security, in terms of financial assistance for the recipient countries as their debt become unsustainable and eventually hinders their growth potential. It's also problematic in the field of technological developments and more broadly for the international rules-based order, since China's behavior favoring bilateral arrangements and power relations in order to ensure that only their national interest prevails contributes to the breakdown of the international order at a time when global challenges would require more cooperation between states. In reaction, the development by the American administration of an increasingly confrontational approach, of which the AUKUS partnership is the latest striking manifestation, with a narrative that tends to spread to US allies, contributes to the intensification of Sino-American competition, heightening tensions and challenges to stability in the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, I would say that there are 2 main reasons why the EU must reinforce its influence in the region. First, because otherwise the EU will quickly lose its strategic autonomy and depend on others' decisions and strategies that will not be conceived first and foremost in the interest of the European Union. Second, because the EU is now the champion of multilateralism, far more than the USA, and must therefore rise up to the task and answer expectations in the region. There is political and economic space for European third way. Instead of contributing to the Sino-American rivalry, our engagement in the region should seek to build a free and open Indo-Pacific market under a fair level playing field and to reinforce multilateralism. But we must also agree on what a European third way means, because indeed, there's a debate among us. In the current context, the European strategic autonomy we should pursue can't mean only or even mainly a form of strategic neutrality, meant simply as the ability not to choose between the US and China. What it means is using the levers at our disposal to engage our strategic partners to help shape the policy environment in the region. The EU strategy is about treating values, security, diplomacy, and economics in the Indo-Pacific in a far more integrated fashion. Logistical capacity constraints in Southeast Asia, the risk of military conflict in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, digital infrastructure choices and economic dependence on China among states across the region all these issues will have an increasing impact on European resilience, technological sovereignty, and economic growth, and on what the EU's and its member states' wider vision is of the preferred regional or global order. This has direct implications for Europe. No longer are EU free trade agreements just about trade, development assistance just about aid, European companies' telecommunication gear just about business, or the acceptance of European technical standards just about regulation. Instead, all these examples provide opportunities for the EU and its member states to enhance their strategic interests and values. We can no longer afford to align sectoral policies in silos. Instead, we need to make choices based on an overall policy. We need to build on the fact that Europe can have a real added value on issues such as trade, connectivity, or green transition for the Indo-Pacific countries compared in particular to the United States, and for two reasons. The first one is because the EU is a global player in those areas, and because its approach is more in line with the Asian approach, developing alternatives to Chinese hegemony, but without entering into an open confrontation. As the geopolitical environment changes, Asian countries are reassessing their economic options through a more strategic prism. This also creates space for enhanced European action, since the EU's and its member states' greatest strength in Asia is its economic sway. It moves the discussion of European leverage in the region away from the narrow scope of presence operations by European navies or targeted arms sales. And since Europe's economic priorities in the regions are growing more contingent on an increasingly complex overall political and security picture, Europe can strengthen its capacity to influence that picture through economic tools and ensure these capacities are better appreciated by major power and small regional states alike. The recent ASEAN 13 summit has demonstrated that many ASEAN countries and beyond want Europeans to cooperate with them in many fields. We have to seize this opportunity to become an influential player in the Indo-Pacific. But how can we operationalize the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy? At this stage, the adoption of the European Indo-Pacific strategy has remained a set-center exercise. If you want this strategy to be more than a set of principles without real substance, if you want it to carry a political message, we must now project it concretely and make it operational. As an important side note, we would also be well advised to discuss the implementation of the EU Indo-Pacific strategy with our main economic and strategic partners in the region, such as India, Indonesia, Korea, or Japan, in order to take into account their own strategic constraints, primarily vis-à-vis China, if you want to make an impact. Considering that Europe's trading power is its strongest asset, the first issue is trade, especially if one views free trade agreements, which can be politically very sensitive, as a means of securing our supply chains, pushing a diversification agenda, and getting out of the exclusive face-off with China. Trade agreements are strategic tools in that they involve not only economic but also geopolitical interests, encompassing a broad set of values, norms, and standards. On this subject, I would simply say that after the signing of the RCEP in November 2020, which accentuates China's weight in the regional economic integration process, the European Union and its member states will have to ask itself, what is it going to do with regard to the CPTPP now that China has asked to join it? The second major aspect is connectivity, which is a commonplace whenever one talks about the Indo-Pacific, thus reflecting the fact that despite repeated professions to the contrary, connectivity in an Indo-Pacific framework is primarily a response to the Belt and Road Initiative. The 2018 EU Asia Connectivity Strategy is strategic in name only and has yet to yield any results. In order to move forward and affirm the European vision of connectivity, one that comes with no strings attached and relies on the highest possible quality standards, we will have to establish a hierarchy of connectivity projects according to their more or less strategic nature and make the financing of projects conditional on their capacity to provide the EU with sufficient visibility and to enable it to reap up not only economic but also political benefits from its investments. We should also seek to promote the Global Gateway initiatives recently made public by the President of the Commission to put forward a European hand-to-hand approach linking project preparation, funding, and European expertise, including the EIB, under the Team Europe umbrella. This one-stop shop approach should also leverage the financial power of the NDK EFSD Plus to deploy flagship initiatives on the ground, with regard in particular to digital connectivity, which plays a crucial role in narrowing the development gap between countries in the region. The EU should offer a credible digital for development third way to the Indo-Pacific countries through converging digital standards and the development of digital partnerships as an alternative to Chinese and American digital models. Another area where there's call to action is obviously green transition. Here again, Europe must fully play its leadership role with a strategic aim. A single example to illustrate this, we have all in mind the ambitious approach implemented with South Africa, the Partnership for a Just Energy Transition announced in the margin of COP26 in Glasgow. It is clear that if Europe commits to building a multilateral offer with its major partners, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as the multilateral financial institutions, to propose an ambitious package to the major emerging countries in the region, such as India or Indonesia, which in return would commit to living coal, we would have a game changer there. At the same time, we have a high impact action to reduce the GHG emissions, and we isolate China, from whom it will become increasingly complicated to refuse to commit to a coal phase out. Another key element will be also the ability of the EU to use a potential carbon adjustment mechanism at its border to create partnerships in the region on the critical question of carbon pricing, which will be the hot topic for the next decade. In the same fashion as the deal on digital taxation, the EU should be assertive and play the carrot and the stick, and if it plays this game well, impose a new standard on the green trade at the global level, which will be both in our interest and consistent with our values. And of course, the Indo-Pacific region is one of the most important places to start. As you all know, there's an Indo-Pacific Forum at ministerial level coming up in February 2022. This event should contribute to the implementation of the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, and we should collectively use it to enhance EU partnerships with like-minded countries by developing cooperation in these key domains. In particular, France will work to ensure that this event leads to concrete, well-identified deliverables, limited in number, but with a very strong impact, to embody the project-based multilateralism to which we are committed to. In conclusion, and as a final note to these two long introductions, and I'm sure you will forgive me for that, I would say that we are increasingly aware that greater strategic engagement with the Indo-Pacific is crucial to defining Europe's role in the world. The adoption of the Europe Indo-Pacific strategy was dictated by necessity. It is not a choice between confrontation of accommodation vis-à-vis China. It is a choice between asserting oneself on the international scene or becoming just irrelevant. An effective development of our strategy will take years, and it is obvious that Europe will not address all issues at the same pace. But limited capabilities can no longer serve as an excuse for inactions, for Europeans no longer have the luxury of ignoring these challenges. We may have to acknowledge that all member states may not agree on a single concept of the Indo-Pacific, and accordingly develop common and consistent policy covering all the issues and all its components. One way forward is therefore for member states to adopt an approach that uses the EU Indo-Pacific strategy as a framework in which to develop policies that will be implemented by various European coalitions, following the Team Europe logic. This way, we can enhance our capacity to act, increase Europe's visibility in the region, and underscore the EU's willingness to play an active role in shaping the emerging geopolitical dynamics. At any rate, one can reasonably expect that the process of bringing forward the European strategy will contribute to a more accurate awareness of both Indo-Pacific dynamics and their importance for Europe, as well as a new mindset that could lead to more coherent and significant policies. And I certainly hope that this morning's discussion in your seminar, your welcome seminar, will prove a useful contribution in that regard. I've been too long, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Miraillet. You have actually led the ground wonderfully for our discussions today. I mean, you have been underlined the recent evolution of the strategy itself with the global getaway, the importance of green transition. But since we're going to move to the first session right now, I cannot but laud you for insisting on the geopolitical impact of trade. And this is definitely what we are going to discuss this morning. Trade is not just trade, but trade is something else. So good morning and welcome to you all in this session entitled Trade as Strategy or Trade versus Strategy, which is very much part of the European today. And we'll try to discuss it at length during this session. My name is Frédéric Gras, and I will moderate the session that is coming now. As I said a minute ago, trade is very much part of the DNA of the European Union. And figures have been mentioned, but just let me remind them, some of them, sorry, to all of you. The Indo-Pacific and the EU account today for some 70% of the global trade in goods and services. Trade exchanges are higher between them than any other geographical region in the world. And if we go by the numbers of the EU Commission, they amounted to 1.5 trillion euros in 2019. One should add that it's already been said that the Indo-Pacific is the largest destination, of EU exports. So indeed, the vast majority of EU member states see the Indo-Pacific as an area of huge economic opportunities. But is it just that? Is that just an area of huge economic opportunities? Let me just say what Ambassador just reminded us all. The recent development I've seen, for example, the signing of major regional trade agreements, the comprehensive regional economic partnership on the one side, the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific partnership on the other one. And they do underline, in their own way, positively and negatively, the centrality of China in the value chain, as well as the risk of over-dependency. On the other side, the EU has pledged in its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific to, and I quote, work with its Indo-Pacific partners to reinforce value chains by strengthening and diversifying trade relations, implementing existing trade agreements, finalizing ongoing trade negotiations, and developing cooperation in strategic sectors, including to address strategic dependency in supply chain. As the question that this session will try to address regarding the adequation between the objective and the means to reach the objective. To discuss the issue, we have the privilege to welcome this morning 4 very distinguished panelists. Dr. Sanjay Baru is a distinguished fellow at the United Service Institute in New Delhi. He has had a long and distinguished career as an economic journalist, being an editor in the major Indian financial newspaper, the Economic Times, the Financial Express, the Business Standard. He was also director for geoeconomics and strategy at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. He's also been the media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Dr. Baru, good morning.
Good morning.
Mrs. Agarkrat is an associate director at the Rhodium Group, where she has the corporate advisory team and leads Rhodium research on European Union-China relations and China commercial diplomacy. She is also a non-resident adjunct fellow of the Reconnecting Asia Project and Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mrs. Pratt, you're most welcome.
Good morning.
Mrs. Maria Martin-Pratt is Deputy Director General at the DG Trade at the European Commission, where she's in charge of the Directorate on Agriculture and Food Safety with the Americas and the Directorate of Industry, Goods, Regulatory Cooperation, and Public Procurement with neighboring countries. And prior to this position, she headed Directorate on Services and Digital Trade, Investment, and Intellectual Property in Asia. Mrs. Pratt, you represent the Commission in this discussion this morning. And last but not least, let me welcome Mr. Hideyasu Tamura, who is Senior Director for Trade and Regional Strategy at the Trade Policy Bureau of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. He has led many international policy operations, especially those related to the Asia-Pacific region, and has been involved in the negotiation of both the RCEP and the CPTPP. He also served as Special Advisor to Minister for Asia and Chief Representative for AEM, METI, Economic and Industrial Cooperation. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Tamura, and I'm sure you'll bring some insight from the dynamics that are actually going on in the region. So to launch this conversation, we have asked our panelists two questions. The first is, as China's centrality in the regional economy is increasing, do you think the way the EU intends to frame its trade and investment relationship with the Indo-Pacific likely to offer options for diversification and rebalance trade relations in the region? And second, we have asked them what would be their country or their own expectation from the EU in this regard. So Dr. Baru, let's start with you. India stayed away from the recent movement of regionalization and clearly appears in the EU strategy as one of the countries with which the EU intends to develop its economic relationship. So how does Delhi, or how do you read the trade pillar of the strategy? And let me just add one thing before I give you the floor. I mean, you can ask you can start right now to ask questions by using the raise hand function or the chat box whenever you feel like it, and your question will be asked later on to the panelists. Dr. Baru, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Grar, for inviting me to join this very interesting discussion. And I was delighted to hear Mr. Michel Miraillet make that presentation before me. I think I would concur with everything that he said and the emphasis he placed on looking at trade from a new perspective. In fact, he said the EU FTAs are no longer just about trade, but will also enhance strategic interests. I think this linking of trade policy with strategic interests is something that China in many ways has forced upon the world. Because still China emerged as a geo-economic power. Trade within the multilateral context of first the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and subsequently the World Trade Organization was not always viewed from a strategic perspective by many countries, though some did even in the past. But I think by and large, we believe that there were multilateral rules of the game and every member of the multilateral system adhered to these rules of the game. China utilized the opportunity provided by its normalization as a normal trading power by the Clinton administration to very quickly ramp up its share of world trade. I think just to mention one more number, you mentioned that the Indo-Pacific region accounts for 70% of EU's goods and services trade. But if you look at the top countries there, China accounts for 11% of EU exports, while India, Japan, Korea, and Australia, four of the major economies of the Indo-Pacific, taken together, account for only 9% of EU's exports. What is even more striking is that China, and this data is for the year 2020, that China accounts for 25% of EU imports from the Indo-Pacific, compared to only 8% in the case of India, Japan, Korea, and Australia taken together. So EU's dependence on China is striking, it's sharp. And the reason for this is, of course, the fact, as all of us are aware, the rise of China as a trading power, utilizing its very unique political system to enhance its global competitive advantage. And a lot of Western multinationals, particularly American, but also European, have made China a base. So when we talk about supply chain management and supply diversification, often it's not about Western companies or global companies reducing their dependence on China. It's about Western companies reducing their dependence on their own China divisions, or of Japanese companies or Korean companies or French companies, reducing their own dependence. I think, recently, Frederick, you shared an essay for a book I written on 50 years of US-China relations, on Henry Kissinger and the rise of China, in which we have presented data that show that a large percentage of imports into the United States from China are by American companies producing in China. So the whole issue of supply chain diversification is not a bilateral issue between the United States and China. It's a boardroom decision within many firms around the world, which in the past have chosen to locate their production facilities in China for very good reasons, and now are under pressure for geopolitical reasons to reduce their dependence. I think it was Edward Luttwak, the historian at Harvard, who first coined the phrase of the logic of commerce, the grammar of commerce in the logic of conflict, with his classic book, in which he called China a geo-economic power. And in many ways, China was the world's second geo-economic power, because if you like, Germany also and Japan, Germany and Japan also emerged as essentially geo-economic powers, not geopolitical powers. And so China was the third geo-economic power. But overtaking both Japan and Germany, China has become the preeminent geo-economic power. And the challenge for all of us in the world today is that unlike Japan and Germany, which have not converted their geo-economic power into geopolitical power, China seeks to do so. So, for example, Germany continues to be a non-nuclear power. Japan continues to be a non-nuclear power. Neither of them is a member of the UN Security Council like India is not. China is a member of UNSC. It's a nuclear power. It has a huge armed force. It has blue water navy, and therefore has been able to convert its geo-economic power into geopolitical power. And so to address the first question, I think there's no doubt that trade has become strategy for China. Your session is trade is strategy versus trade versus strategy. Trade is strategy for China, has been for China. And the conversion of geo-economic power into geopolitical power is what China has done through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the Maritime Sea Route, through its forays into the rest of the Indian Ocean, its the stance on South China Sea, sea lanes of communication, etc., etc., etc. So I think Europe has to come to terms with this fact, and I can see that has happening. The whole dialogue is part of that process. That we can no longer view China as a trading partner. Certainly for India, I speaking as an Indian, India can no longer view China as a trading partner, which is one reason why we did not join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because it was not simply about trade. It was about a trading order established by China, which has emerged as, I think Mr. Miraillet or you very correctly used the phrase hegemonic power in Asia. And that is what India resists. What India requires with the European Union is a much more focused security dialogue or a strategic dialogue, which looks at these economic challenges. We have security and strategic dialogue with individual countries, but I think with European Union, I'm not aware if, in fact, there is such a dialogue, but I guess the current review in the EU of the Indo-Pacific strategy offers us this opportunity. Finally, on the question of over-dependence and diversification, I think the point I would make is that one is not talking about decoupling from China. Donald Trump, I think, used that phrase decouple, and I don't think that is something that is possible. And I don't see any country, including India, seeking to decouple from China. I think what everybody is seeking is de-risking and diversification. And I think there are two very different concepts, because decoupling is viewed in China, and rightly so, as a kind of containment strategy, like the United States followed, or the West followed vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. But this is not a containment strategy. This is really one of preventing China's hegemonic rise or use of its trade policy as an instrument of national security and strategy. And therefore, what we are really looking at is a diversification away from China, de-risking from China. And that last concept is extremely important given what is happening within China. There was a certain predictability about China even till 2 years back. Despite all the signs of Xi Jinping's growing authoritarianism and his centralization of power, the view about China was that it had acquired a certain framework of governance which was stable. I'm not sure if one can continue to take that view today. I don't have time to elaborate on that, but with that, let me stop. I think I've exceeded my 7 minutes. Thank you very much for your hospitality.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baru. We may have time in the discussion to come back to some of the points that you've made. I'd like now to turn to Mrs. Crive. You're a China expert, but you also bring the perspective of the private sector in our debate. So what is your take on the trade dimension of the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you, Frederic. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Thank you, Dr. Baru, for excellent remarks. I've tremendously enjoyed your comments, especially the last few ones. I hope we pick on that on the Q&A, because I have a similar opinion on the state of the Chinese economy at the moment and its economic model and what that means for the future. But that's not what I'm going to speak about today. I want to just give a quick introduction here to our discussion. And I want to take an economist point of view. Rodium, as some of you may know, specializes on studying China's economy and its relationship to its main global economic partners, including the EU, of course. And so this is the hat I will put on today for responding to the question we've got. In the 7 minutes I have, I want to react directly to the title of the session by saying that trade is undeniably strategy for the EU. For one thing, it's the one lever that the EU has strong and definite responsibility over, contrary to military or security means. And so therefore, we can confidently use it in our relationship to Asia. But second, and most importantly, what I would like to argue is that trade is exactly right for tackling a series of EU strategic concerns regarding China in both a multifaceted and versatile way that suits our objectives. First, trade is key to answering Europe's need for diversification. COVID-19, but also recent power shortages in China have highlighted how dependent Europe is on global supply chains and how much of a cost that dependence can create in times of extreme tension. The thing is, extreme tensions are actually likely to become more commonplace because of more intense climate, economic, geopolitical developments and tensions. And so it is in Europe's strategic interest to rethink its current sourcing model. And in that context, Asia can play a key role for 3 reasons. First, because the risk highlighted over the past couple of years by COVID and once again, power shortages more recently, I would agree with Dr. Bao, are not due to the global nature of supply. They're due to the over-concentration of supply on China. Hence, there is actually space for continued globalization, if not more globalization of supply chains, but with Asia excluding China at its core. It's about diversification. It's not about just moving out of globalization altogether. Second, and relatedly, Asia is key because full reshoring is just unrealistic. I think there was a lot of talk about reshoring post-COVID-19, but for the good of our firms, for the good of our consumers, we actually need to favor a model of diversification first, relocalization second, or we create the risk of enormous diseconomies of scale and inefficiency. So here again, Asia excluding China is a natural and pretty unique ground for welcoming that diversification. Third, Asia is key because to get our firms and our companies on board with some of our strategic de-risking goals, and I'm reusing Mr. Barro's word here because I think it's key, we actually need to provide those companies with a credible alternative to China. Else, they're just going to continue business as usual, investing in China, doubling down on Chinese value chains. And I believe in the world today, only Asia can actually provide companies, our companies, European companies, with a credible alternative to China. So this is why trade is so important here. Beyond supply chain and supply chain de-risking, I think a strong trade approach and strategy is also crucial for Europe to make sure that global standards are leveled up, not down, in a way, again, that favors our companies and our consumers. Much of the challenge we had with China over the past 5 years has actually crystallized around the issue of China's economic model, which at the Rhodium Group and more broadly, I think have tried to show that economic model is now diverging rather than converging with our own market economy model in many ways. And at the moment, I think many China experts, but also many policymakers, believe that it's getting harder and harder, if not impossible, to convince China to revert back to a convergent path and to just more market economy and more market principles. And so because of that, we need to set in motion all possible efforts to ensure that the rest of the world doesn't follow in China's footsteps, that the rest of the world doesn't adopt China's model as its own. And trade here is probably the strongest of all strategies and the strongest of all weapons, because with trade agreements that put at their core ambitious level playing field, labor rights, data and environmental standards, we can try and push back against that global trend. We've seen CPTPP and RCEP gain a lot of traction in Asia at the moment, and we're seeing Asia lead the way in showing clear willingness to engage in trade agreements, even at high European levels of standards. And so this is an opportunity for us to step in. Finally, and third, trade is key for responding to China's Indo-Pacific push. And here it's a way of not saying Belt and Road Initiative. And I look forward to the discussion on that on the next panel. But, in fact, countless countries in the region have a strong dilemma, very hard dilemma with China. They're oscillating between strong strategic and military concerns around Beijing's aggressive regional behavior and a seemingly inexhaustible thirst for China's economic engine. This is just the conundrum many and plenty of Asia's countries are stuck in at the moment. And so if the EU wants to build support and traction in the region, it absolutely needs to put on the table a trade and investment strategy that works for the region and that puts an alternative down and responds to that conundrum. In doing so, I would argue that it needs to present an alternative that gathers both quantity, which is China's key asset, but also quality. And this is straightforward for Europe. In terms of quantity, EU is the world's largest market in many sectors and in many ways. It is one of the main investors still in the region. In terms of quality, the same is true. Provided good communication, we can make the case that with high standards, we can bring to the region a more balanced trade relationship, when Asia's relation with China has actually been highly imbalanced over the past 10 years and getting worse and worse by the day. So for those three reasons, it's clear to me that trade needs to be part and, if not center of Europe's strategy for the region. But I do want to end with a note of caution, because the path ahead that I just described seems clear, but it actually requires a little bit of fine-tuning at home. Impediments are actually many and not to be underestimated. The problem is trade is actually much more easy to sell in Asia than it is to sell to our own constituency at the moment. We've seen in the US, how trade has become an area of strong popular skepticism, so much so that US presidents have actually made it either a scapegoat and erected significant barrier to trade the past 5 years, or just used it very selectively, arguing that trade needs to be first and foremost serving US workers, and mostly that. This is not just a US phenomenon, of course, partly because of China, partly because of tech, partly because of climate concerns, and partly because of other economic woes. Trade is not that fashionable today in Europe either. Think about Mercosur, think about our agreement with Canada, and also think about pending elections in France and other key member states at the moment that are not particularly trade lenient in nature. So Europe needs to similarly, maybe similar to the US in some ways, frame its trade strategy at home, domestically, as both strategically important, which it is, and contributing to our own domestic well-being, which I think is absolutely right. So let me stop here, and I hope we have a good discussion after that. Thank you everyone for having me.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Katz. I mean, you have highlighted a number of very important points, and we'll come back to that, in particular, the form that the strategy that the EU should develop should take in the future. Let me turn now to Mrs. Martin-Pratt. Mrs. Martin-Pratt, you represent the Commission in this discussion, and I think that nobody is better placed to explain us what was the rationale behind the making of the trade dimension of the document, the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. I feel that a number of the dilemma, I mean, the resistance to trade, be it in the US or Europe, are being reflected in the document, just as well as the ambition to go further than it's been before. But I mean, can you explain us what the value added of the document is as compared, for example, to previous EU approach to the question? Mr. Martin-Pratt?
Thank you, Mr. Greer. And let me start by obviously thanking you for having me in the discussions today. By the way, I fear maybe you got my wrong bio. I am indeed Deputy Director General in DG Trade, but I'm not responsible for the United States or agriculture, rather for the Indo-Pacific and services and digital.
And I apologize, very
quite fitting. It's good that I have the right responsibilities for the discussion today. And let me start specifically saying that I did also enjoy very much both the opening intervention of Mr. Miraillet, and now specifically the interventions of Mr. Baru and Agatha. Agatha and I have discussed over many years now matters related to China and the Indo-Pacific. Let me refer to start to something that Agatha mentioned now towards the end of her intervention, which is how do we design trade policy in a manner that is not only effective for the objectives we have, but it's also acceptable for those at home, for those that need to back the policies we are making. And I think there's been a very, very strong effort from the side of DG Trade, and from the side of the European Commission and the European institutions in general, to pass not only the message about trade being fundamental for our economies, and I think that is quite undeniable. It's hard facts in terms of what trade does for not only creation of jobs in Europe, but also attracting investment, providing resources that we do not naturally have, and foster innovation. But I think we have also made a strong effort to say our trade policy, it is also a trade policy that is not only open, but also it is sustainable, and sustainability is at the core of how we conduct our free trade negotiations at the moment. And it's also assertive in the sense that while we remain open, we do understand as well the importance of defending our interests, and we do not hesitate to do that. And you see it in also the number of unilateral measures that we are putting in place with the objective, in some instances, to defend our security, in others to foster a level playing field and avoid the distortions that sometimes practices of third countries create in our internal market. Important as well, as much as we are talking about the Indo-Pacific and the countries in the Indo-Pacific, multilateralism and the role of the WTO, we continue to think that is in the interest of all. At a time when the world seems to be going towards more and more of a dominance about by 2-3 players, a multilateral system that is rules-based is in the interest of many players in Europe, also in the Indo-Pacific. And also as a general point, but it's been discussed now in the last 2 interventions, trade is a very, very important tool to reduce vulnerabilities. Indeed, we are not going to reduce our dependencies in terms of trade with other countries. What we need to ensure is that there is a diversification of our dependencies. We should engage with the world, but we should do it in a more strategic manner. Now, what is the role of the Indo-Pacific in today's trade policy? And it's a trade policy that increasingly gets blurred with foreign policy. That seems to be unavoidable. It's not only happening in Europe. And it has advantages and disadvantages. I take what Agatha was saying, well, it is very important because trade policy is very strong. It is strong, it's an exclusive European Union competence, so that always brings a strength. But it's always dangerous, and you always need to be careful if you try to address a multitude of problems with a single instrument. Trade can bring many positives, but cannot replace foreign policy, cannot pretend, for instance, to inject political change in countries and so forth and so on. So I think we need to be careful with a tendency I observe now for a number of years, which is to think that through trade agreements, you can reach objectives that go well beyond trade. One thing, for instance, is to include objectives such as sustainability in trade. And another thing is to think that it's only by trade that you can ensure sustainability in third countries. It may seem as if we do have a very new strategy into the Indo-Pacific. I would rather say that we have formulated it to present it in a coherent manner, but our engagement with the region is long-standing. Among our strong and well-established trade agreements are those that we have with partners like Korea or Japan. Some of the most recent free trade agreements that have been ratified are those with Singapore and Vietnam. So our links with the region are long-standing, and as you know, we are negotiating with Australia, with New Zealand, with Indonesia, and there's been recently the announcement that we resume negotiations with India, both on a free trade agreement and an investment protection agreement. So our presence in the region is important, and I think it's fair if I say that the negotiation of free trade agreements with the European Union is quite a comprehensive exercise. They have on a number of issues, and that includes our trade and sustainable chapter, trade and sustainable development chapter, but also our provisions related to level playing field, like for instance, in terms of state-owned enterprise disciplines or subsidy disciplines. We do have a level of ambition that you do not necessarily find often in other trade arrangements. We also think that increasingly we need to engage in the region, not only with the purpose of those more traditional free trade arrangements, but working together in terms of standard setting and working together for the development of new rules. I'm speaking specifically on a tendency that you will see increasingly in our discussions with the region related to digital partnerships agreements in view of the need to start thinking as to the rules, the standards we need for the part of the economy that is becoming increasingly important for all of us, and that is not always well addressed on the basis of the rules that we have, both when we have bilateral trade arrangements and also at multilateral level. For instance, we had the first ministerial trade committee with Singapore last week in Brussels were part of the discussions that took place between the Singaporean Minister of Trade and the Executive Vice President and responsible for trade in the European Commission, so between Mr. Isawara and Mr. Dombrovskis, was related to the need to launch a scoping exercise and discussions as to what else do we need between the European Union and Singapore, but the rest could be, the same could be said between the European Union and other members in the other countries in the Indo-Pacific. What is it that we need to lift barriers to digital trade, to facilitate the digital trade, to make sure that digital trade is a possibility also for smaller companies, for companies that may not be invested in the region, but may be interested in cross-border trade. It's a whole area of work that is also sometimes referred to as electronic commerce, which I believe is going to test not only our engagement and continuation of building of relations with the Indo-Pacific, but also new forms to cooperate and start getting into, if you want, a regulatory cooperation rhythm that should help us avoid divergences and avoid having afterwards to negotiate for even longer to try to make sure that we lift e-returns and an open market. So all that to say that what you will see in our strategy from the point of view of trade, obviously, will be a combination on the one hand of the implementation of the free trade agreements we have and the continuation of negotiations or open of negotiations as regards new trade agreements, but also much more of an active regulatory engagement and cooperation on matters where we think rather than establishing our own rules and then trying to make them work together, there is a merit in having a discussion, in particular in some areas that are being developed at the moment, and many aspects of digital fall under that category. I think I'm going to stop there. I don't want to abuse of my time, and I'm happy to engage them on particular questions, whether it is on specific aspects or countries in the region from the point of view of DigiTrade.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Martin-Price. You certainly have an abuse of your time. Before we turn to Mr. Tamura, let me just remind everybody you can start asking questions either in the chat box or through the raise hand questions, and we'll take your questions and try to answer them in the discussion. So, Mr. Tamura, you have been involved, I said in introduction, in the negotiation of the RCEP and the CPTPP. And as such, you bring a very unique insider's perspective on the trade dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. So what potential benefits do you see for your country and the region from the EU strategy in the Indo-Pacific as is currently formulated? What would be your expectations? Or any remarks you may have about it, by the way.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. And so before beginning my remarks or comments, I'd like to say that today I join as a kind of more personal kind of position, and not to explain the official position of Japan, because if I say something on the official position of Japan, I have to say that, okay, other countries or economies, regional trade policy, it's up to them. So I don't want to make that kind of quite, so superficial comment, but more on the substantive comment with my personal, position. Yeah, and thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak up. And so joining the RCEP and the CPTPP negotiations, of course, these negotiations were quite dynamic. As Dr. Baru said, I experienced what's happened in Bangkok in November 2019, when India decided not to join RCEP at this juncture. And of course, the kind of decision would be, we have to, of course, respect to each country's own decision. But I wish India could engage more in this region. But anyway, And I had several speakers previously talked about diversification. And I think diversification is basically the same strategy of Japan in terms of the trade. And so we negotiated a TPP, original TPP 12. And unfortunately, US at the previous administration withdrew from the TPP, and it eventually became CPTPP. But in cooperation with Canada, Vietnam, and other partners, we finally came to TPP 11 as a CPTPP. And now, as you know well, United Kingdom is on the accession process, and China, Taiwan, those aspirant economies are trying to accede to that agreement. And also, even after India withdrew from the final phase of the negotiation, we concluded our CP, and will enter into force on January 1st of next year. So only 15 or 16 days ahead, we're going to have our CP into place. And Japan joined both agreements because we need diversification and a kind of, higher set of rules. And from the viewpoint of diversification, of course, CPTPP or TPP is a kind of, more sort of like-minded countries group, and setting higher standard rules in terms of the state-owned enterprises, intellectual property, government procurement, and e-commerce, especially in relation to the data free flow and prohibition of the data localization or setup of the computing facility in each country. And also, of course, China is there. So sometimes, even in Japan, sometimes people misunderstand the LCP to be a kind of more, a kind of symbol that Japan became closer to China. But I don't think that's a kind of right, interpretation or understanding of that agreement. And now several presenters here today spoke. I think it was Dr. Baru that decoupling and diversification is a bit different. And I fully agree with that kind of comment. And in this kind of globalization and regionalization is progressing world, nobody can decouple with each other. So considering that factors or background in mind, the reason why we concluded RCEP was first to get, more enhanced market access to other countries, including China. And so that Japanese, core manufacturers can stay in its, own destination and export to other countries, and also to set up a kind of set of rules, including the intellectual property and prohibition of performance requirement, including the technology transfer requirement in the investment chapter, and basic, principle of the data free flow, those kind of set of rules in this region, and make some kind of bottom up from that. Of course, compared with CPTPP and EU's agreement with Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and Singapore, some elements of rules are missing in RCEP. And say, especially on the state-owned enterprises and market access kind of provisions or rules in the government procurement chapter, and source code in the e-commerce chapter, those are missing in the RCEP. But at least we have formulated the foundation for the further bottom up of the rules in the regional level, and we are trying to further develop that rule, those kind of rules after the entry into force of the RCP, and turning the eye to EU as Ms. Martin Pratt said. Ms. Martin Pratt, thank you very much, and thank you very much for working with my fellow colleagues, including Matsuo-san and Ono-san. I really count on you for many issues, and thank you very much for working with us. And one thing I'm so curious about is how EU gonna develop FTAs with currently negotiating partners, like say Australia, as you mentioned, Australia, Indonesia, India, especially vis-a-vis Indonesia and India. The key would be a kind of sustainability issues, I think, and like say environment, labor, and unfortunately, in our bilateral with these countries and also in the outset, we could not incorporate those kind of elements sufficiently in the current agreements. But we wish to elaborate further towards the future. And one thing I expect EU to work with us is to, like say, work on the enforcement on those rules in the region. And our trilateral trade minister meeting between EU, Japan, and the United States, it could be one function, but by utilizing, trade agreements or investment treaties, we could further do more to develop this area's rules. And by initially starting from the enhance the enforcement of the existing rules, and then to further developing towards higher level. That could be the issue or objectives we could work together in this region. That's my initial intervention. Thank you very much, Frederick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tamura. I mean, we have had a set of excellent presentation, really setting the stage for the discussion with very different perspectives. Before giving the floor to the audience, and again, you can start asking questions in the chat box, I'd like to ask you all to answer a very simple question, which is the level of ambition in trade of the strategy per se. We have seen, well, the text says, speaks about implementing existing trade agreements, which is important, finalizing ongoing negotiations, and doesn't really open the way for new partnership, even though India, for example, would perhaps be the counterexample, since negotiations are resumed. How do you assess the level of ambition of this strategy? Is it the maximum that one can get? Is it suboptimal? Is it just right at the right level, and so on? Let's start with you, Mrs. Martin Pratt.
In terms of the level of ambition of the trade component in the Indo-Pacific region, I will define it as very ambitious, and I will explain why. In terms of geographical coverage, we are engaging in negotiations with an important number of partners. There are others where negotiations for the time being are suspended, and that responds in some cases to clear divergences in the level of ambition, in others to matters related more to the domestic situation of the country or foreign policy concerns. Then when it gets to enforcement of those agreements that we have, I will also define our policy as very ambitious. In particular, in the last 12 to 18 months, we've made a big effort to shift attention and resources towards the implementation of trade agreements. We understood very clearly that trade is not just about negotiating and concluding an agreement, it's about ensuring that you enforce it and that you can show them on the ground, including to your own constituencies, the benefits that trade has. And we've been very busy with a number of countries in the region on matters related to enforcement of commitments, whether it is in the sanitary and phytosanitary related aspects of our agreements, or on commitments taken and the trade and sustainable development, such as those in relation to ratifications of ILO conventions and respect of ILO fundamental principles in labor. So I think that there as well we are within the constraints everybody has at some point in terms of resources, but showing a high level of ambition. And then more generally, as to what we put on the table to negotiate with our partners. Again, I think in terms of balance, we try to include the elements that are related to more traditional market access and addressing discriminatory practices and beyond the border obstacles to trade, with elements which are quite specific to the European Union, but that are fundamentally important in our trade policy at the moment, which relate to sustainability. And there I can very quickly relate to the point made by Tamura Hideyasu as to how are you gonna do to negotiate the level of ambitions you normally include in your trade and sustainable development chapters with some of the countries in the region. Well, we are doing it. I'm not saying it's easy. I am sure that that will be part as well of our discussions, for instance, with India in a very animated manner. But fundamentally, as regards core principles related both to labor standards and to environment and in particular climate standards, including very basic principles such as commitments not regress in terms of the level of protection with a view to attract investment or trade. These are matters that are fundamental to us, not with a view to do a labor policy or environmental or climate policy through trade agreements. I need to be clear, and that's something I was trying to say in my initial intervention, but with a view to ensure that we trade on the basis of principles that we think are fundamental, and frankly also with an important element of level playing field, and knowing that these needs to also be complemented by a number of autonomous measures, whether you're talking about a carbon border adjustment measure, whether we are talking about a specific unilateral instruments we may adopt on matters such as the eradication of forced labor from our supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Pratt. Mr. Tamura, how do you react to this question? I mean, how do you assess the level of ambition of the strategy vis-a-vis the stakes in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, thank you very much. And okay, when it comes to level of ambition, it could include quite various meaning, like including the how many percentages in the market access liberalization, or how high the rule could be, or how comprehensive it could be. Those kind of many issues could be included. And but yeah, okay. So my initial reaction to that question is, of course, yeah. Okay, when it comes to EU's trade policy vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific countries, I think EU is quite, we really respect EU's basic position to, pursue the higher level of ambition as possible. Yeah, and but at the same time, when it comes to the level of ambition, there could be some kind of, diversified viewpoints in the several chapters. Like say, when it comes to e-commerce or digital trade, maybe that could be one of the favorite topic of today's participants. But there could be some, divergence between the, like say, some sort of CPTPP RCEP model and the EU-based approach, like say the treatment of the data free flow provisions. And of course, there is a kind of legitimate public policy objective exception in those kind of Asia-Pacific style agreements. But EU's approach could be even a bit different, like say on the data free flow. And so when we talk about level of ambition, some kind of fundamental question could arise, which could be the higher level of ambition. That kind of issue could be the one which EU and Asia Pacific countries could further elaborate our ideas. Of course, that could happen in the context of the FTA negotiation or some of the regional cooperation agenda between EU and Indo-Pacific countries. And sometimes it could be the debate in the multilateral forum, like says WTO e-commerce joint statement initiative, or some discussion in the OECD. But that could be one issue when we talk about level of ambition. And of course, sustainability issue is quite a big key point. And yes, Ms. Martin Pratt is quite right that we should eliminate or remove forced labor in the supply chain. I fully agree with that. But at the same time, how we could embody or incorporate those kind of elements into the trade agreement itself, or starting from more kind of soft law or less binding kind of style. That could be the issue we have to discuss and elaborate a bit more when it comes to level of ambition and the trade arrangement between the Indo-Pacific countries and other developed nations like the EU, US, and Japan. And so in that regard, I'm so much interested in how India could work with EU and recently resumed FTA between the two parties. That's my initial reaction to your
Thank you very much.
question. Thank you.
Dr. Baru, let's turn to you now. I mean, India has been mentioned, and India stayed away from the regionalism, the ongoing regionalism, in particular the RCEP, for the reason that you indicated. But how would you assess, as an economist, the level of ambitions of the EU strategy on trade matters, and what are your views on this whole question?
Dr. Bahu, I believe you're muted.
Yes.
We would love to hear you.
Thank you. I'm sorry. First, India itself is going through an internal debate on trade policy. Not in any formal sense, but certainly it's a very serious internal debate. It was triggered partly by the sudden decision to opt out of RCEP, which has been internally criticized. I myself was critical of the government's decision, but many others have been critical. And so there is a review internally. Second, the last year, couple of years, our trade has not done too well. That has triggered an internal review. And third, the feeling that we are at the moment left out of all plurilateral trade agreements. We are not a member of any FTA with EU, with any of the ASEAN countries. We are opt out of RCEP. We are opt out of all other agreements. And so there's a sense that is this the right strategy? And there is an internal debate going on within the government. How this debate will finally come out will then determine the way in which we would look at EU. But certainly, has already been mentioned, there is a revival of interest in EU. And the revival of interest in EU, in my judgment, seems to be more from a strategic geopolitical perspective of building relationships with countries, other than just the United States and China, but middle powers, whether it's Germany, France, UK, Japan, and so on. But so how much of our renewed interest in EU is a function of these political instincts, and how much of it is coming out of the Ministry of Trade is not very clear to me from the outside. I'm not in the government. But I think that will also define to the extent to which we are willing to discuss issues, because the foreign ministry tends to often pull the cart in a different direction from the Ministry of Trade. And these differences have had serious consequences in the past, including on the RCEP decision. Finally, I think I recognize the point that has been made by Ms. Martin Pratt about the way EU looks at trade issues. I also respect the way in which Japan looks at trade issues. But I think the reality today is that we are looking at all these plurilateral trade frameworks because the multilateral system has collapsed. And for India, that is a huge setback because we had assumed or hoped that the multilateral system would be able to address our needs, particularly with respect to special and differential treatment, sustainability issues as they've been referred to, and so on and so forth. Now, given the collapse of the multilateral system, and again, the recent postponement of the WTO, I do think there are trade partners, whether it's EU, the United States, Japan, Korea, etc., must also take a serious look at the level of dependence that they wish to maintain vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis other countries, certainly vis-a-vis India. And to what extent are they willing to address some of our concerns? Final point I'd make is that I was happy to see the focus in the EU paper on the strategic dimension to trade, because maybe we can address some of these challenges, which I recognize exist, particularly at home in European Union, by allowing the debate, encouraging the debate within the EU to understand the strategic significance of doing more trade with other Asian democracies, whether it's Indonesia or India or other countries. I hope I'm clear.
Thank you very much, Sanjaya. Mrs. Katz, can you give us your views on the very same question? I mean, the level of ambition of the strategy and the way you look at it.
Yeah, and here I just want to make 4 very quick points. The first one is just to say that it's always really easy for researchers to make recommendations. I remember writing a paper 4 years ago about how the EU should have a foreign subsidies instruments. And well, it's taking 3 years and it's going to take a few more months at least for it to wrap up. And it probably took me, 6 months of research and 15 minutes to write it up on my computer. So very easy to make a suggestion, very hard to translate anything into actual policy and strategy. So there's a lot I will say here, but there's also a lot that needs to be taken with just a pinch of realistic salt. One thing maybe I was missing from the strategy was a more robust discussion of the CPTPP, of course, and what the EU plans to do with it. I saw a lot of questions on that in the chat, and I think this is something that more so from a strategic point of view rather than an economic point of view, I felt as a researcher, I felt as a China analyst, what was important to address. Digital free trade agreement is something I'm still missing, because in a context where China's digital regulation are ramping up, the way you counterbalance that with digital economies of scale is by teaming up and creating more interoperability. Doesn't mean everyone needs to have exactly the same standards, but just more interoperability between our digital spaces, and discussion of, well, a WTO alternative. I'm putting it here, and it's unpleasant to the ear, but a plan B for whether the WTO actually gets anywhere in the next 5 years. Now, the second thing I want to say is, given the policy constraints that are weighing on EU's shoulders, I think the strategy is actually very realistic. And I think it is where it can be, and it is where it needs to be, given those constraints. One thing I'm missing even more than those robust discussion in the strategy document on, once again, CPTPP, digital free trade, and a WTO plan B, is a strong domestic discussion on trade. I'm not seeing France's election pick it up. I'm not seeing a strong discussion on trade in Germany. I'm not seeing anywhere in Europe, actually, policymakers making the case for a more strategic approach to trade. And this is missing. I think I saw in the comments someone referred to US's retreat from TPP as a capricious self-harm move. But I think we're at a point where we need to convince our population that there is value in trade, and there is value in strategic decisions that maybe go beyond economic economic perspectives. I remember speaking to someone who worked on TPP from the US side, and just speaking about the feasibility study that didn't show exceptional returns from the agreement other than strategic. And so to think that you can convince your population that trade is important without explaining to them the strategic aspect of it beyond the trade aspect of it, I think is mistaken. So before we have a strong strategy on trade to go beyond all of those aspects, we need to have a strong domestic discussion, and this is still very much missing, I think. I think the document wasn't the place for new trade ambition anyway. And so that's my third point, because what was missing for EU strategy wasn't a trade strategy. The EU has been good formulating trade strategy. Actually, it's been good implementing trade strategy for the past few years. What we were missing as China researchers was a strong strategic vision for the Indo-Pacific. Trade is part of that, but all of the part of it aside from trade were what we were waiting for. And so I think that's fine. We needed an Indo-Pacific strategy that went beyond trade. We got it, and that's the right thing. The last point, and I think back to Maria's argument, is that in fact implementation is key. There's lengthy negotiations. Implementation are just as important. Also because back to the domestic debate, at some point you need to prove that all of the agreements you sign have a value for your population, have a value for your national or European interests. And only by implementing and actually living through some of those next generation trade agreements can you make that point and bring that point home. The proof is in the pudding, so to say. And so I do agree here that unless we have a strong case and a strong case study to bring back home, we can't be too ambitious either in the context of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Agatha. Well, there will be a lot of things to answer to that. But anyway, let's move to the audience now with the question which seems to be the question of the day, if I judge by the number of times that it comes back in the discussion, and for which Agatha's intervention was a very good transition, which is the question of the CPTPP. Over the past few months, we have seen the UK applying for membership. We have seen, of course, China the very day after AUKUS was announced. We have seen now South Korea and so on and so forth. Would it make sense for the EU to apply to become a member of the CPTPP? Again, that's a question that I would like to ask all of you with different perspective. Questioning the question of acceptability of it by Mr. Tamura. This is head up. The feasibility, you, Mrs. Martin Pratt, and so on, and all kind of remarks, of course, that you may have over it. So let's perhaps start with you, Mrs. Martin Pratt, about is a very simple question. Is it a good idea?
There are no simple questions in trade, so I'm not going to take that question as it is. But I'm going to frame it in a tiny bit of a broader context because I think it's important. Otherwise, we're simplifying the issue to an extent that is not helpful. We continue to be convinced of the importance of the multilateral trade system. And it's not only a matter of conviction, it's what it's at the moment determining how you engage in trade and investment with other countries on a daily basis with the majority of the world. So if it was not to be there, your life, our life, and the economies of our respective countries would be extremely difficult. So talking about the demise of the WTO is a very, very, very serious affair with serious consequences. A different thing is to say it hasn't managed to keep up with the rulemaking function that it has. We have a crisis created first and foremost by the US in terms of the dispute settlement mechanism. There are a number of issues that need to be addressed. including the fact that a number of their members, and Mr. Baru referred to it, do not recognize their interests as being sufficiently reflected in the organization. All that shows to an organization that is in trouble, but it by no means shows a direction to a country that will be in a to a world that will be in a comfortable situation without the WTO network of agreements being in place. So let's be very careful with that. And I think it's just something that allows me to say, therefore, let's not go and say because WTO is not functioning as it should we not try to rebuild around the CPTPP, or there are other discussions, for instance, what about putting more emphasis around the countries that are party to the OECD? Again, do remember the world is very large. The Indo-Pacific is very large as well, but the world is even larger. And as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, leaving aside the geographical reality, unfortunately, because that probably will mean nicer weather, but Europe is not an Indo-Pacific continent. You could tell me that's the case as well for the UK, but the geographical realities of the UK are for the UK to determine. But I think at this point, I will find it challenging. Certainly is not part of the discussion that we have internally or externally to imagine the European Union will consider joining an agreement in place in a region of the world with which we have our own trade relations and continue to develop them, accepting a number of standards that we may or may not agree that we may consider sufficient or not. I'm not going to get into digital in detail, but I'm happy to do that. It's one of my favorite subjects. I don't think there is a difference in ambition. I think it's a difference in approach that we have. And I don't think the approach that Japan has and is being reflected in the CPTPP is different from, in terms of the objective, from the objective we want to have. We just have a different approach. But I think they are both compatible. And I think our politicians are more recently in discussions between Japan and the European Union think the same. So that to say, please don't give up multilateralism. Of course, regional integration is of an extreme importance. And of course, the strategy of the European Union is to engage with the region, but that does not need to pass necessarily through a joining of the CPTPP. Unfortunately, the reality is a bit more complex.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Martin-Pratt. I mean, we'll come back to the question of multilateralism in a little later. I'd like to turn to Mr. Tamura. Japan has initiated the TPP first, not the US, actually. And then, of course, after the US withdrew from the treaty, the CPTPP. How would you see, well, first of all, same question that Mrs. Martin-Pratt, does the idea make sense to you? And how would eventually Japan would react to EU application for membership?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's quite a difficult question to answer, but okay. So before getting to that, specifically on EU, I'd like to explain how Japan and other TPP or CPTPP members are, thinking about the new, approach from the aspirant economies, and it's quite obvious. And our fourth, and actually this year was Japan's chair year for the CPTPP, and in June and September, we organized two TPP commission, which is a kind of ministerial level meeting. And for the both of the ministerial level commission, we issued a kind of joint ministerial statement. And our way of thinking on the membership is quite obvious in that document, which is like say, of course, we have to maintain the high standard in our sense, and both in terms of rules and the market access. And from that kind of viewpoint, we respect, well, we are trying to examine how, each new applicant or aspirant economy is prepared well for the, the high standard. And one of the elements for the kind of examination or, our those kind of accession procedure is a kind of track record. And track record means first, how new aspirants, how those economies are committed, in the previous trade agreements on the rules equivalent to CPTPP. And for the case of the UK, after withdrawal from the European Union, UK has committed several bilateral arrangements with CPTPP member countries, including UK-Japan bilateral comprehensive economic partnership. And in these agreements, UK committed to a higher level of set of rules in these agreements. So we thought it could be quite appropriate for UK to join, UK to commence the accession procedure. And now we are in the process of examining how UK could comply with the CPTPP agreements without setting up new exception or special arrangement or treatment. And the same kind of manner of our approach to new or approach from in relation to the approach from the new applicants, we take the same kind of examination procedure. And it's quite obvious that China and Taiwan could be a bit different from the UK because of their previous commitments and the trade agreements, and especially for one economy, their behavior in the multilateral, arena, including the WTO, and how they behave in the G20, like say on the steel excess capacity. We have to examine those kind of past track records, and because it is a kind of quite important foundation to provide the confidence to CPTPP members that new applicant can comply with CPTPP rules and high standards. And that's a basic way of thinking of the Japan and other CPTPP countries. And that kind of viewpoint, of course, once EU, this is kind of quite hypothetical answer or statement, but if once EU decides to accede to the CPTPP, and we're going to take the same kind of process, and as I said, of course, EU is a kind of partner on the high standard economic rules, including our bilateral and also EU's bilateral arrangement with Indo-Pacific countries. But at the same time, there could be some kind of divergence, especially in terms of the digital related rules and agreements. So how we could accommodate with each other, that could be quite a big question or issue. Once this is of course the hypothetical discussion, but once EU decides in that kind of way, the specific provisions in the digital could be one of the issues we have to further discuss. That's my personal viewpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tamura. Mrs. Katz, you highlighted the topic in your previous intervention. I mean, how do you see things from your perspective?
I mean, here my response is going to be pretty short. What I said in my previous intervention is, do I want to see more discussion of pros and cons of joining the agreement in the paper? Yes. But I think I said that in my previous intervention as well. Do I think it should be the utmost priority for the EU at the moment? Probably not. I think, once again, implementing what we've got, negotiating what we've got, but also working on our autonomous instruments are probably three priorities I would put ahead of it. I think I want a discussion, and I want a long-term discussion about what it means, what are the pros and cons, and how much we should invest in that. Whether I think we should actually devote more resources right now and on year one to a few other areas, I think actually yes. The other thing is, do I think it is feasible at the moment in the current political environment in Europe? I would also have questions. And once again, I go back to my point, which I think is the most important one I wanted to make, that unless we make trade fashionable again domestically, we're just setting ourselves for failure here. If we're starting a whole new negotiation, a CPTPP negotiation here. So that's something I wanted to say. Two more things. I do think it's helpful for the EU to deal with a trade group, a large trade group anyway, and to be assured that the standards that we're pushing are anyway being implemented through the CPTPP in slightly different ways, potentially slightly different levels, but that they are raising up among that group. And then, you know, the last thing to say is, I think especially in the global gateway strategy, I saw discussions of much lower scale ideas, ways, and channels to foster some of the important discussion I mentioned, especially around digital interoperability, that would make it possible to actually engage just on a more ad hoc basis. So it doesn't need to be a region-wide agreement right from the start, but you can actually have country-to-country bilateral discussion about how each of us manage and govern their data economy. And I think this is actually a great place to start to try and get to the same result and a good use of resources at the moment. So just wanted to make that clear actually in my second comment.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start another chapter, and I'd like to start with you, Dr. Baru. I mean, the question of multilateralism has been mentioned earlier. You insisted on the problem that the collapse of the WTO system did create to India, something that Mrs. Martin Pratt emphasized as well. And the modernization of the WTO is very much part of the agenda of the EU strategy. How would you see this modernization of the WTO? You're still muted.
I'm so sorry. First of all, it's important to recognize that the reason that the WTO has been in crisis is because a large number of issues which have been mentioned this afternoon as constituting superior trade agreements have not been acceptable to many developing countries. And because they were not acceptable to many developing countries, plurilateral agreements have been entered into which incorporate higher standards, quote unquote. Now, the strategic issue in the world today, since this session is about trade as strategy, is what is the world, at least what is the European Union trying to do? It is trying to reduce its dependence on China. That's the core geopolitical issue that we are talking about. When you say EU has an Indo-Pacific strategy, it's really about reducing dependence on China and diversification into the rest of the Indo-Pacific. For a large number of members of the Indo-Pacific, not Australia, not Korea, not Japan, but certainly ASEAN and India, and certainly all of South Asia, and certainly all of Africa, are all countries which have been arguing that the change in the basic rules of the game after the Doha round was launched has created this problem. And therefore, unless we are able to address the original problem, I don't see how we can really move forward. I mean, if we are going to say that, oh, we want to revive WTO, but on our terms, meaning the term Singapore issues and all the other new issues that have come up, trade facilitation, digital trade, etc., which are all the issues which led to the collapse of subsequent ministerials under the Doha round. So we are really looking at a dead body and saying, how do we inject life into this dead body with medicine which has been rejected by that body, which is why it died. So I think there are fundamental issues. I'm glad we have had this discussion today because it's actually clarifying my own mind on this, which is to say that we are at a moment in time when at least the European Union has to make up its mind, and not just at the level of Brussels, but at the level of boardrooms. Because I know from my recent discussions in Berlin where I was at an interesting dialogue. The boardrooms of BMW and boardrooms of all the major German CMNs and German companies with business interests in China are not yet very sure whether they want to reduce their dependence on China, right? Because their global strategy is based on the current level of dependence on China. So if you are not very clear about what exactly is the strategic component of the trade policy, then merely focusing on tinkering of trade policy in order to revive the WTO process, I don't think is going to go very far. What I would like to see is bringing larger strategic issues into this discussion on multilateral trade so that we can go back and say, okay, why did WTO come into existence? Why did it have problems? Who are the main sources of those problems? Which country has benefited most from WTO and which country adheres least to the WTO? Let's answer those questions and then we'll have an answer to the whole issue of multilateralism and the Indo-Pacific.
Mrs. Martin-Pratt, you have heard Dr. Baru. From an EU perspective, are we still in a deadlock in the WTO, or do you see way forward?
That is, I think at this point, we are not in a good place in the WTO, which is still far from saying this is the end of WTO. And I explained in my prior intervention why that will be a fundamentally worse scenario. But what's the shape of the organization? Is the organization in good shape? No, it's not. And it's not because we see really problems with the rulemaking part of the organization and also with the dispute settlement part of the organization. Plus, the organization should be mainstreaming discussions that have become very important for trade and that are not yet part of its core set of rules. And there I do refer as well to issues related such as trade and environment that are essential if we want the organization to remain meaningful going forward. Now, it will be too long to try to understand the causes for the situation where we are now. I'm just going to take one point which was also referred to by Mr. Baru, rulemaking and multilateral versus plurilateral. There, I think that, well, making sure we give enough space for the interest of all members, we also need to understand that an organization of the size in terms of membership of the WTO can hardly function on the basis of consensus in the 21st century. I wish it was different. I wish we were in the 1960s, but we are not. And even in a shorter life dealing with negotiations in multilateral organizations, I have seen a very, very sharp shift from where we were, say, in the 1990s as to where we are now. Plurilateral agreements don't need to mean agreements that are close to the membership, which benefits are denied to those in the membership that don't participate, or that are not of interest for all countries, including, if you want, least developed and developing countries. And there are, in terms of the joint statement initiatives that you were referring to, one often talks about the one related to e-commerce because it does cover issues that are often debated, including Mr. Tamura's favorite issue related to data flows. But look at what's happening in the discussions on services and domestic regulation and the discussions related to investment facilitation. Investment facilitation in particular has over 100 participants. You can hardly describe this as an initiative led by a core of Ottawa group members or that type of membership. You do have many that do recognize the benefit that the facilitation of investments, the type of rules you are looking in, can bring to their economies and their development. So, and the same applies to domestic regulation as regards services. What I'm trying to say there is that some of the plurilateral efforts that are on the table respond to interests that cover a very wide range of WTO members, not just those that you will normally suspect to be in the lead of discussions. And I think we need to be realistic. If you say no rules until everybody agrees unanimously on new rules, you know what you're saying. You're saying there will not be new rules. And I don't think that's in the interest of anyone. So open and inclusive ways of developing multilateral rules is something that we should seriously consider.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tamura, is Japan in favor of modernization of the WTO? And if so, how does it see the process? Are you on the same line that, let's say, the EU? Are you closer to the position of Dr. Baru in India? I mean, what is the Japanese position on this?
Well, thank you very much. And first, I'm not directly in charge of the WTO reform or WTO issues, but from my, so my statement could be a bit more, superficial compared to CPTPP or RCEP, but please allow me. And in that regard, I fully echo with what Ms. Martin Pratt said, that of course, if a kind of unanimous agreement by the 100 more countries on the specific rules and the new disciplines could be achieved, that's the best thing, of course, needless to say. And but at the same time, especially in terms of the rule making, we need a bit more. And this kind of plurilateral or like-minded countries approach could be a kind of motivation, or could be the catalyst for the, enhancing the discussion by the multilateral parties, and also that could be the basis for the discussion in the regional or kind of more a kind of a regional trade arrangement or regional specific sector arrangement. And one example, that's not the one example which Japan is not a party, but recently I heard Singapore and Australia is thinking about a kind of new agreement on the green economy, and also New Zealand, Fiji Islands, and Norway, and several other countries are recently discussing something on the environmental agreement on the sustainability, climate change, and trade. Those kind of new arrangement. And I think that kind of discussion was, in some sense, catalyzed from the multilateral set of discussion. And of course, as I said, the best way is that all members of the WTO or as a multilateral forum to come up with a kind of one common rule. But in this particular, situation, it's quite it's impossible in my sense. So of course we need a kind of maintenance of the multilateral dispute resolution systems, but at the same time we have to be realistic and come up with some kind of set of rules which like-minded countries who are plurilateral approach and further spread to other countries. That kind of approach is quite realistic, and we should pursue those kind of approach in the plurilateral agreement, and also in the in the joint statement initiative, so on and so forth. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Agatha, you bring sort of a neutral perspective on this. You're not representing a specific country. So what is your view on the way WTO, or can the WTO be modernized, and if so, how? Well, that's a huge question, I know, but I know you have a capacity to be
it is a big question for
in your remarks.
We've got 4 minutes, right? So here you go. I just wanted to make a quick comment, a few quick comments. The first one is Mr. Barou took the question of the WTO reform from the point of view of developing countries, requirements, desires, preferences. I want to just take a very slightly different point of view that comes from my background as a China expert, which is to say that the WTO today is not responding to the issues that have to do with China. It is unable to respond to the problems that China's economic model, political model are causing to the world. And here, I am not denying in any ways that the organization is keeping the current world together. But what I'm trying to say is that it is not responding to the biggest challenge facing it. So of course, it is keeping our current status quo livable, but whether it is responding to what's coming next, I have big doubts about it. And what I want to say here is that when we think about WTO reform, what we need to do is we need to re-upload our assumptions. We need to update our assumptions, because in a context where the WTO is not responding to the China challenge, we're never going to get the US on board. The US is very clearly, very undeniably, very strongly uncommitted to an organization that doesn't solve its China problem. And whether or not we think the organization is a good thing, whether or not we think it binds the world together in a way that's positive and that it makes our daily life better, we can't think it will work in the future with US support if it doesn't solve the China challenge. And so this is just the one thing I want to say, is that the assumption on which we lay our discussion of the WTO reform needs to be that one, that the status quo has changed. It isn't the status quo of we've got a big organization, it's hard to get along, but the status quo today is the biggest member in that organization doesn't want it to survive because the organization is not helpful to it. And so under that consideration, I think what I meant by a plan B was not getting rid of the WTO, but exactly what you said, Maria, to say, can we think of subgroupings? Can we think of plurilateral approaches? Can we think of an open discussion that would segment some of the WTO discussion, some of the groups within the WTO? Is that feasible? If that's not feasible, we need to think about something else. If that's feasible, we need to invest in this, because under the current status quo, which is not the status quo we had 2 years ago or 5 years ago, we can't be thinking about reform the same way. And so that's my main thing. We need to be realistic, and we need to be realistic about what the parameters of international organization making mean today, whether a consensus organization can work today in a world where China and the US just want to fight all the time. If a very, very large organization with very, very broad body of members can work as well today in a world where the US and China want to fight all the time. Those are new assumptions, and we need to be realistic about those. We can't make decisions the same way. So that's the only thing I wanted to say to close us up.
Thank you very much, Agatha. And we're running out of time, but there is one last question that I would like to ask Mrs. Martin Pratt, because this comes out very clearly of your intervention, which is, from an EU perspective, is there a fundamental contradiction between regional grouping and multilateralism? Are they really antithetical? Because this is the question which is being asked, which has been asked for the past few minutes, and this is a simple question of you. And you answer it, we say, well, perhaps, at least from a naive perspective, not really very clear as to what direction you were ready to take.
Mr. Carl, I didn't hear you. I don't know if others had problems with the quality of the sound. It was extremely cracky. Would you mind?
The quality of the question as well.
No,
the question is the compatibility between regional grouping and multilateralism, to put it simply.
There's always been compatibility between regional grouping and multilateralism, and these, I don't say it as a general statement. There are the rules in place that allow both systems to exist side by side, despite the fact that sometimes this create quite tricky, maybe for trade nerds type of problems. If you think, for instance, in terms of rules of origins and supply chains. So I don't think that one thing excludes the other. I guess my only call of attention will be to go towards a direction where we try to reinvent something that we have already tried to invent in the past, and to recall that, you know, the world, the European Union is very large, the Indo-Pacific is even larger, but the world is even larger. Nevertheless, I think it's undeniable. We are getting into the era of regionalization of trade, with the consequences that that may have. And you know, the European Union itself is an entity that has created an internal market that trades between 27 countries. So it's not for me to say that one thing excludes the other. I'm going to have to apologize. I'm really going to have to jump out of the meeting without even having the time to listen to your closing remarks, because I need to be in another meeting. But I just wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to be here and for the very, very interesting discussion. It's a pity sometimes with this discussion, you wish you could also be in the same room and have them live, but okay, that would be for another time. With my apologies for having to jump out so quickly.
And we will thank you for that, and we will thank all the speakers. It's now time to bring this session to a close. So thank you very much to all of you. To all the audience, we will resume our work at 11:30 sharp. So please join a few minutes in advance. And again, to all the speakers, thank you very much for a very rich conversation, which I hope we'll have the opportunity to continue. To you
Thank you,
all a
Frederick.
very good day, and goodbye.